Hello and welcome once again to the accidentally named Free Thought Blog's Podish-Sortacast, where people who are used to writing instead try to talk live on camera. This month, we're talking about the almost euphemistically named justice system, or systems, what that means in different governments, what they do to us, and how we wind up with them. We're going to do something that's perhaps a little different because the international nature of the Free Thought Blog's commentariat and bloggers leaves us able to take a wider perspective on this than the usual strictly US-centric point of view on these things. So the first thing we're going to talk about briefly is where judges come from in various different countries, starting with our local Danish blogger, Christian.
Yeah, well, I mean, I had to do a little bit of research for this because, as in every other country, the judges are actually appointed by the Minister of Justice or the Secretary of Justice. But the process until the Minister of Justice actually appoints a judge is a little bit different, because it's a job like everything else. Is listed and people apply for it. So people who feel they're qualified for a job, they apply for it. And then there's a panel of the existing judges actually go through the hiring process and pick whoever they want to. And then after having picked whoever they want to, it goes one step up the judicial level, and they just have a brief veto if they find somebody unqualified. So it goes kind of through two layers of judges before it's recommended to the Minister of Justice, Secretary of Justice, whatever you prefer, and then in that case, they always appoint whoever got recommended. So it's kind of a job hiring like everything else. It's just a different bunch of people who evaluate you, which from everything I hear is quite different from the US system.
It's interesting. The panel that judges them at the first level, that's other judges who were hired via this process?
Yeah.
And ultimately
and also the people on the second level are also judges. It's just a higher level of judges. Of course, when you hit the Supreme Court, there's no higher level, so they have to make that recommendation by themselves.
So you're saying it's actually done, the hiring decisions are partly made by the judges who are actually at the higher level of court, like in the appellate system type of thing?
Yeah, but you have at the kind of at the city level and kind of we have three levels like most places, and it would be the people you're going to work together with are involved in the hiring process, and the people at the level above it, the people who have to evaluate your work as a judge, because all the appeals go to them, are also involved in hiring you. So they can only blame themselves if they get too many bad decisions their way.
Interesting. Is there a system for a judge to get fired?
Yes, at the basic level, if you get there's no legal protection as a judge against getting criminal charges, and if you're found guilty of a criminal charge, you, as a general rule, are fired. So that's kind of the easy way. And then there's an age barrier. You can get fired after you're 65. You can get fired after you're 65. You don't have to get fired. And if there's a restructure of the kind of how the judicial system is set up, people get fired. But as a general rule, you can't just get fired on a daily basis. You have to kind of fall into one of these categories. But they decided a long time ago that above 65, there's a high risk that people's abilities to be a qualified judge will kind of diminish over time. So they put in the opening that after you're 65, you can get fired.
So on the basis that there is no perfect system, the thing that jumps out at me there is, so there's no way for a judge who engages in misconduct that does not rise to the level of criminal to be fired for it. Are there other reprimands?
Oh, you can always, I mean,
did I ask questions deeper than the research you did?
Yeah. No, but the thing is, it's kind of, I mean, you have the same workplace protections everywhere else. So if you kind of break the kind of workplace protection, you would get fired. It would just be a more complicated process than the others. So if you conduct if you behave in a way, but most of those cases, there will usually be there's going to be a panel of other judges that they evaluate whether you're qualified or not to continue. But the other ones are kind of the when I was talking about that was kind of really strict rules about when you could get fired or not fired. Is basically they put in the age thing, so you can make sure. But if you behave in a way that's inappropriate, it actually it must. I mean, obviously it happens, but I actually don't know of any cases, so it's kind of rare. And I think it's probably just gets handled behind the scenes that the judge retire or find a different job because they don't want to get into the whole process of being dequalified. But obviously, if sexual harassment would be an obvious kind of behavior that you could see happening, then yeah, they would get fired.
Interesting.
But the thing is, that's because behavior. I mean, that's because behavior outside of they can't get fired because of decisions at court. So if they make a horrible wrong decision, it stands. But I mean, then that's what the appeal court is for.
Until and unless the Supreme Court gets corrupted.
Good
thing that sort of thing can't happen, right?
We haven't had that problem yet so far. And as I said, this process doesn't easily lend itself in the same way as does in other countries. So
an excellent segue. Let's move to some other countries for the sake of the contrast. HJ, would you mind telling us what you've learned about how Canadian judges get picked?
Indeed. Canada has an interesting legal system with some minor differences from the United States. Probably the more interesting thing that I've learned is that we actually have a tax court. If you have problems with your taxes, there is actually a distinct court separate from our usual judicial system which will handle that. Conversely, if the Canadian Revenue Agency says you're, in arrears with your taxes or something like that, they don't go to normal court, they go to tax court, which is kind of fascinating in and of itself. When it comes to actually appointing our judges, though, we do it a little bit differently. In the United States, judges are actually appointed by the Senate, which is one of its primary responsibilities. They are selected...
Practically only responsibilities.
Pretty well, at this point, yes. There's sort of like a blue ribbon thing where senators can actually, put like a veto on whether or not a specific judge comes or not. Usually, if you're sort of appointing for a specific circuit, you listen to the senators who are part of that circuit. They have suggestions, they're voted on, and then the Senate sort of says up or down. In Canada, again, this is different. Over here, justices are appointed by the Governor General. Now, if you're not aware of Canadian, Constitution and all that, originally we were a colony of Britain. And we had, essentially, the Queen was our monarch and sort of guided everything that we did. She had the supreme authority, even over Parliament itself. With our revised Constitution of 1982, that was actually changed a little bit. Her representative to Canada, the Governor-General, was essentially reduced to a ceremonial role. It still sort of it's technically above Parliament. The role is still technically above Parliament. But in practice, it's more or less a figurehead in and of itself, and really sort of lives as a ceremonial / ambassadorial role, and unless there's like a severe constitutional crisis, it really doesn't play a role entirely. So, with the Queen kicked out in 1982, it is the Governor General who appoints justices to here. Now, if you thought that this is a bit of a contradiction, I mean, I said the Governor General is a ceremonial role. You are correct that it's a contradiction, but that contradiction resolved because the person who selects the judges for the Governor General is the Prime Minister. That's right. Currently in Canada, it is Justin Trudeau who handles the federal Supreme Court, the chief justices on the provincial courts, and since there's a whole ton of other judges, and you can't really sort of bother the Prime Minister with that sort of thing. That's handed off to the Minister for Justice, which the Prime Minister appoints. And those are the judges that sort of get on there.
The Minister of Justice being appointed from the elected officials for that party, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So essentially, the buck stops at the Prime Minister. There is no vote within Parliament. It's basically just what the Prime Minister says, and that's that. But we do actually have a mechanism to advise the Prime Minister on who to appoint. There are these folks called sort of judicial appointment committees. They actually have a formal structure. If you actually go search Canadian judicial appointees, you can actually go and find an entire list of who's there. For most of the justice system, ignoring the tax court thing, which is its own separate thing, there's actually 7 members on these things, and they're sort of set up per province and for the feds as well. There is one non-voting member who is a former justice. Doesn't really have any sort of influence other than being like a sort of a meeting taker kind of thing, or acting as an advisor. And then there's 3 other members, 3 of which come from the judicial system in general. Now, they're not actually judges per se, but they are lawyers or legal scholars in some sense. And they're actually appointed by non-government related judicial bodies. So like, the Bar Association, that sort of thing. The remaining 3 are citizen appointees who are supposed to sort of be representative of the general populace in some way. They actually are instead appointed by the Prime Minister. So, yeah, generally speaking, it's people that the Prime Minister kind of likes or something like that. I haven't seen a lot of political influence on it, although there have been stories of, Justin Trudeau appointing people who people sort of like, wait a minute, this person's a little bit too political. You shouldn't be appointing such things.
How is it possible to be a highly political Liberal appointee? What do they stand for?
Well, people who have been part of the Liberal Party sort of party per se. They're
Of
actually
the
like
machine.
Exactly.
I would suggest to any viewers is that if you're getting the impression from this that the Canadian system of government is a very complicated and surprisingly heavily decorated clockwork system, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Arguably, I don't know if that actually makes us better or worse. Generally speaking, the reason why you haven't sort of heard a lot of things about, malfeasance within the Canadian judicial system is for one of 2 reasons. One, our journalism sucks right up here. It's underfunded. There's nowhere near enough, sort of money flowing into it, and we don't really have the same sort of history of investigative journalism as the United States. So nobody's really sort of digging into these issues to sort of reveal anything that might be happening. But also, B, a lot of this actually sort of depends on on electoral norms. If the Prime Minister is straight and good and actually does do decent appointments, nothing wrong with that. And generally speaking, we have not had the same problems in Canada as there has been in the United States with that. So we're kind
We'll
of
come
living
around
on.
to some of why that is shortly. But speaking of the United States, let's move from there. And I apologize for making you the representative of the US in this discussion, but Cryptike, would you mind giving us a quick overview of judgeships in the States?
Sure. So I want to first preface this by saying that I think that HJ, one of the things that helps keep the Canadian system honest is that your law societies, essentially the bar associations in Canada, are actually stronger and have a different, stronger ethical mandate for keeping individual attorneys in line, and that strengthened system of norms, I think, in what's effectively the bar association in each province in Canada, I think creates a less corrupted source for the pool of talent that becomes judges. So I think that's an advantage that Canada has. The bar associations in the United States, I don't think, are as strong, and they don't have the same mandate to manage the professional class of attorneys. For instance, go ahead.
I was just saying, you're saying it's a lot harder to get the Barrett or Kavanaugh situation here.
It is. It really is. So the bar association, the bar associations here do have a role to play, but their role is much more distant. They typically, in terms of Article 3 judges, and let me make a distinction here between 3 different types of judges. One type of judge is directed to be created by the Constitution of the United States, the federal governing document. And the federal courts are created by Article 3 of the Constitution, and those particular judges at the federal level are given lifetime tenure, and they are the ones that HJ referred to that are confirmed by the Senate. But most criminal cases are not federal criminal cases. Most criminal law is state law. And so in the United States, determining how the judges are seated is much more about what states do. It's not that there isn't a federal parallel to Canada, but simply that that's a minority of judges that don't deal with nearly as many of the criminal cases that everyday people will see. If you are arrested for drunk driving, that's going to be a state case before a state judge. If you're arrested for drug possession, it is almost always a state case for a state judge. The federal government gets involved primarily for crimes committed either on federal property or which are by their nature cross borders. So if you're directly involved in the importation of drugs, that's different. You may be charged in a federal case. But on the state level, criminal judges are often elected. And this creates another level of corruption where bar associations actually do typically review candidates for judgeships that are standing for election. And they'll put out a report saying that the judge is well qualified, qualified, or not qualified. But then it's up to the individual voter to decide whether or not they want that person. These judges often run unopposed. And it's very rare for a judge who's been elected once to have their qualified rating downgraded to not qualified. By virtue of the fact that qualified under the Bar Association standards are usually pretty minimal, and if you have past experience as a judge, you're presumed to be able to continue doing the judge's job in the future. So if you have a judge that's been acting horribly badly, Clarence Thomas, although he wasn't a judge at the time, he was in a different office. But when he was putting pubic hairs on the soft drink cans of his subordinates in ESL, like that sort of behavior generally does not get you downgraded from qualified to unqualified by the Bar Association. But even if it did, because judges run for elected office so often unopposed, if there's only one candidate, people are going to check the box next to that candidate's name. Very few people inform themselves about this. And that local process for judgeships is, I think, much more corruptible than even the Senate process, which you've seen has its problems at the federal level. So we have the state judges, we have the federal Article 3 judges, and then we also have additional courts. HJ mentioned the tax court in Canada. It's not the only court in Canada that's separate. Canada also has an immigration court and some other courts that are handled separately.
Family court.
And so in the United States, there's something called magistrate judges at the federal level. They're called different things in different states, but they are not given lifetime appointments. They're usually given term appointments, often 5 years, although it changes for different types of judges. And so when you go before an immigration court judge, oftentimes that immigration court judge is appointed by the head of the Border Patrol or the Customs Immigration Service with the consent of the president. And so, so since these cabinet level offices are highly political, and Republicans often use these offices as a way to specifically torment people of color, immigrants, you can't trust that the immigration judges that you're going before have anything remotely like the checks and balances, even of a public process like Senate confirmation. Yeah, and then the last thing is just that even the Senate confirmation process for the lower level judges, they often vote on a slate of judges all at once. So they might have 17 names, and they're saying we're selecting these 17 names for the lower courts. On the appeals court level, on the Supreme Court level, they do do vote on the names one by one, but oftentimes there isn't a particular individual review. The individual review is assumed to have happened by the president, by the Department of Justice, before the names ever arrived at the Senate floor.
Interesting. So, when judges are elected in the United States, are they elected into the same and by the same electoral districts that would elect House or federal representatives?
No, because these are the elected judges are state elected.
So it's a statewide ballot?
No, but the divisions are often county, which don't bear necessarily any relationship to how the federal divisions for the U.S. House of Representatives are divided up. So,
right. So I shouldn't have mentioned federal. So they're the same electoral districts that are at the state level?
Right. So you have county judges, you have city judges. Those usually county, but occasionally city. Those judgeships are defined by the electorates of other political subdivisions that are well known. So Multnomah County in Oregon is Portland plus a bit, and Multnomah County courts are elected by the same people who elect the Multnomah County commissioners and that sort of thing. And there's a close relationship between the elected officials within the court system, the district attorneys, the prosecutors, and the county commissioners, and not quite as close, but a somewhat close relationship with the Portland city commissioners and the Portland mayor.
So from a very distant view, from 20,000 foot view, from and aliens who hadn't actually lived in any of these countries, it would really sound like the Canadian "no, just you," says the Prime Minister, effectively, system would be the most corruptible, followed by the insular hiring process of the Danish system, followed by the every couple of years the people get to claim they don't like a judge system in the States. But the reverse seems to be true.
No, I would definitely agree. What do you all think?
Yeah, sounds about right.
But isn't that
I must admit I can't see how you could say you would put that order, because but I might just be colored because I know how the US system works, so I can't see why it sounds like it's the least corruptible.
Well, I mean, from a huge distant standpoint, if you didn't have an experience of how these things work, the idea of an electoral system in general is supposed to be minimally corruptible, because if you get a bad person elected, theoretically, they'll do a bad job for a couple of years, and then all the people will say, that sucked, you don't get to have that job anymore. Hypothetically, that's how elections are supposed to work.
I would agree for a position that doesn't require a certain skill set.
Yes,
and as a judge, you require a certain skill set. So in that case, there's a problem with election.
Well, yes, but what I'm trying to get at is, it seems like in practice, weirdly, the more hypothetically democratic a process is for electing officials, the more corrupt it is in practice. That's weird. So I'm wondering if that's because the corruption or failures have struck at the structure of how the elections are run. The reason I was asking Cryptike, so is that the same as the state groups, is because at this point, in many states in the US, the shape of the districts, the gerrymandering is so intense that appellate and federal courts keep throwing them out in a few states. Which I don't want to go into it right now, but there's all kinds of skullduggery and running out the clock being used to keep the shitty maps in a few places right now. But I was just inquiring whether that's part of the problem. If the entire thing is you wind up with highly partisan judges being elected by highly partisan electorates in districts that have been forced to be highly partisan.
I think there are two things here. One is that the distinction between a parliamentary system and the political system in the United States. The political system in the United States rewards a two-party system. It's not set up for multiple parties, for alliances. Multiple parties and alliances don't get you better success than one large tent party. And so there are there are various historical reasons for that, which I'm not necessarily expert in, or actually I'm not expert in. But over time, we've seen third parties come about in the United States, and every time a third party erupts, one of the other parties collapses, and we end up back with a two-party system in the United States. Although other parties, I say every time a third party erupts, I mean like to the significant degree where you can get a presidential candidate that's getting 20% or more of the vote. We do constantly have low-level background third-party activity, the Greens, the Libertarians. Those parties exist, but they don't have any functional effect on the House of Representatives or the Senate, and they certainly don't affect who's elected president. Okay. So they don't govern the United States.
So yes, Christian, do you want to insert there?
I also think it's important to remember that when you're having a re-election principle, which was where the starting point was with the judges, they had to appeal all the time to people instead of trying to actually doing the most kind of correct decisions. And unfortunately, we have seen that being tough on crime and other horrible ideas is kind of the way forward if you want to get re-elected as a judge in the US, or even as a politician sometimes. So that's probably also part of it, that when you're having it, that the people who appeals the most to people are probably people who should never be elected in this case. Does that make sense?
I think so. I want to take a very, very quick detour there because I have a question. What is the general shape of the political structure in Denmark? Is that also parliamentary or?
Yeah, we are officially a royal kingdom, of course, but as everywhere else, we don't really listen to the royalty. So yeah, we are a parliament with at the moment a minority government of one party, but usually it's a coalition of parties that runs the government. Quite frequently as a minority. So they always have to kind of find votes outside the government. So
interesting.
So even if there was some kind of political process for appointing judges or other kind of people, public employees here, it's kind of tempered by the fact that there's a lot of people's different parties' interests you have to kind of cater to, as like rightfully said, this is a coalition thing. So
personally, I definitely prefer coalitions. And HJ wanted to say a few words about one of the things that personally I think is one of the most important institutions that Canada has for avoiding corruption.
Yeah, it's when it comes to elections within Canada, it's actually managed not by any sort of political bodies, but by an independent body known as Elections Canada. This actually has become quite popular. It's attracted the attention of the United States, where a number of states are actually toying with creating similar bodies as well. And Election Canada has a really interesting past in and of itself. Back, before the First World War, Canada's elections were actually sort of run more or less like the United States, where it was actually governed by Parliament itself. The government chose how elections would carry out, and those would then sort of carry forward and all that. In 1917, though, a controversial change was made to elections during the war itself to sort of help speed things along. The Canadian Parliament decided to allow women to vote. This basically,
Good Lord.
yeah, this actually led to a huge critical backlash, saying now that the electoral process in Canada had been discredited, that Canadians could no longer trust that people were properly sort of being elected to run them and all that, simply because of this change. So to help restore confidence in the system itself, the government actually set out, okay, we're going to set up a committee to sort of study the problem and decide what exactly is the best outcome that we could sort of do from this. And I mean, typically, if you're used to Canadian committees, you know the Canadian sort of response to things. A, you appoint a committee. B, that committee returns results. And C, you ignore those results. In this case, that didn't actually happen. What happened is this committee said, okay, we're going to set up an independent corporation. The government is just going to shovel money at this corporation. No sort of political thing other than that. And basically just saying, yeah, it's in order to restore this, we really need to make elections as independent from the parliament as can. And so there's actually an individual elections Canada board, which is set up to actually administer these things. It takes its own cues. It ignores essentially what Parliament does, other than essentially Parliament saying, okay, we don't have the confidence of the people. We need a new electoral vote. All the machinery is sort of run by that. Elections Canada actually runs advertisements on themselves to encourage people to come and be electors. And it otherwise is sort of more or less what you expect from an electoral system. They do actually have provisions for mail-in votes and all, and it's usually a little bit more liberal. Although there is some sway within the parliaments itself. But there was a big deal recently, a couple of years ago actually, within the Alberta government itself, when they put new restrictions on voting, where you actually had to show some form of ID to show where your location was. While this sounds fairly draconian, i.e. voter ID laws within the United States, the list of what qualified as a valid ID fills half a page. Like, if you can actually show, a bill to our landlord or something like that, that's sufficient to get you, in the door and be an electoral thing. If you had a prescription filled out in your name, that's enough to prove that you are who you were. So it's incredibly liberal, even if it does require some level of restrictions on that. And so,
Enjoy the phrase, that's all it takes to be an electoral thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, officially on July 1st, 1920, Elections Canada was created and has been running our elections ever since. It's become so popular, in fact, that they've got various branches. So, in fact, within Alberta, there is an Elections Alberta, which handles electoral matters within Alberta itself. And there's also an Elections Calgary, which handles elections within Calgary proper. As suggested, it's a very successful model, and it's starting to be, some states are actually considering copying it in the US of A.
So that's the shadowy organization running the elections, huh?
Exactly.
They're not very shadowy. Your typical shadowy cabals don't put giant yellow signs advertising themselves all over every building for miles around.
That's what they want you to believe.
Oh my God, the shadows are bright yellow. So as far as I can tell, that has a lot to do with, it's hilarious. It was created in response to women getting the vote. Okay.
What kind of madness is this? We can't trust you. You won't elect the right people. I like that, actually. I mean, it's always a stupid reason for setting up a proper process, but it helps, I guess. So another good thing by giving women the right to vote happens.
Yes.
Well, this is, to my knowledge, that's the Elections Canada, and its operation is a lot of why I wouldn't say we have zero But Canada doesn't have nearly the gerrymandering issue specifically that is so prevalent in the States, because this nonpartisan group is what's in charge of deciding the ridings, which is Canadianese for electoral district, basically.
Yep, that's all handled
And
via.
then we just appointed.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I said in Denmark, we just appointed a bunch of bureaucrats to handle this stuff. Nobody can understand how the map is made, but it seems to work, and it's actually, if you look at it, apparently the most correct, because of voting system representation of people. Everybody complains about it, so it must be good.
Well, as long as everyone's happy, I guess it's fine.
No. Everybody's unhappy. That's the important thing. If everybody, if somebody happy,
as long as everybody's unhappy equally, it's fine.
Exactly.
Okay.
And even though we're lucky to have Elections Canada sort of running the deal up here, that does not prevent all sorts of electoral chicanery from happening. If you want, I can actually talk about the 2021 municipal elections in Alberta. Sort of an interesting tale for how exactly things play out.
Perhaps we'll come back to that. At the moment, though, we've left Cryptike on mute for far too long. And I expect she's got something else to say about the electoral system and its side effects in the States.
Sure. So just as I started to talk about with judges, but continues on in terms of gerrymandering, because we have this two-party system, and you don't have to worry about courting people that currently aren't on your side to be on your side later, the way that minor parties with smaller amounts of representation in parliament might be courted. Without those shifting allegiances, the only motivation seems to be to win, right? And so over time, you get a stronger and stronger desire to see your opponent suffer rather than to simply institute a policy that you think is good. And for that reason, we not only get judges that may not be qualified, but we also get this desire to increase one's electoral majority through gerrymandering. As I said, Wisconsin is a particularly bad example of this. Ohio is fairly badly gerrymandered. And both of those are Republican gerrymanders. The Democrats are not immune to doing this, but the only state where they've done that extensively is Maryland. And I think it helps to know that this is also partly related to the drug war. The drug war is a highly corrupting force in the United States in its politics. And Maryland, as a state, has been particularly badly affected by the drug war for various different historical reasons. The District of Columbia and Maryland being in proximity to the capital have made them laboratories for federal drug war tactics. And as a result, there's been a lot of corruption historically in DC and in Maryland's politics. And
wait, did you just say all of Maryland is a federal drug lab?
Yes, I did. I meant it in the sense of experimenting with new policies rather than actively drugging people. To my knowledge, they're not actually putting hallucinogens in the water. But
we'll check with QAnon on that one.
Yes. But no, that they're very much a laboratory for testing the drug policing policies of the DEA and other federal government agencies that monitor shipping and importation for drugs. The Port of Baltimore is a particularly large port. It's particularly heavily corrupted by the drug war. Some of you may have seen the series The Wire. It's not at all accidental that Baltimore, the closest big city to DC, is used as this testing ground for a number of federal policies, and because of that, they don't have as much local control, and there's also quite a lot of more fighting about the meaning and the direction of different allocations. It's also a heavily Black city, and this has created a tension between the largely white federal influence and the largely Black local influence. And so we have had some significant corruption in Maryland. That's where the epicenter of Democratic gerrymandering has been. But there's always been Republican gerrymandering as well. And in the last 20, 30 years, the gerrymandering efforts on the Republican side in particular have escalated quite a bit. And so right now, the problem with huge gerrymanders in the United States is largely on the Republican side. Again, Democrats are not immune to this, but it's largely confined to Maryland for the Democrats, whereas there are at least 8 states that I can think of that are badly gerrymandered by the Republicans. And this creates real difficulty in terms of implementing policies that are actually democratic. Now, we already have an anti-democratic Senate. A lot of people may know, a lot of people may be from the US and understand that the least populous states have the same representation in the Senate as the most populous states. So you have, 50 million people or whatever it is in, no, sorry, it's 35, 38 million people in California are represented by the same number of senators as 700,000 or 800,000 in Wyoming. So there's a huge disparity in representation there. And that happens not by deliberately constructed gerrymanders where we're attempting to provide one party an advantage, but rather just based on the pre-existing borders of the states and by the construction of the Senate as directed by the federal Constitution. So between the active gerrymanders in the House and the passive gerrymander of the US Senate, we end up getting very non-representative electoral bodies in the United States. And that makes it very difficult for actual majority perspectives on justice to prevail.
That's interesting. I want to back up slightly, and I don't know, this question didn't come up before, so I don't know if anybody actually has an answer for this, but we all know, I think, that the war on drugs that CD was mentioning a minute ago, in the States, that was an explicitly partisan electoral / racist policy introduced by the Nixon administration. However, most other Western democracies, like less so in Europe proper, but certainly Canada and England, had similar laws. Like it was the same substances that were identified for hypothetically the same reasons, but it wasn't the same electoral politics. Does anybody know why that happened? Was that like something pushed by trade or by treaties or something?
I think in
Not
Canada's
exactly.
case.
Sorry,
Go
let's hear
ahead.
HJ first.
Yeah, sure.
In Canada's case, we did sort of have a war on drugs, but in the sort of typical Canadian sense, we're very polite about it. There are still the same differences of structural racism, certainly unequal sentencing and all that. It's just there was more bipartisan support, and it wasn't sort of blasted all over the media a la Fox News or anything like that. It just wasn't the same level of pushing of it.
So we didn't have so much a war as a stern disapproval.
Exactly.
Christian, what were you going to say?
I mean, to some degree, we had a war on drugs in Denmark, but we also have a very big focus on treating people and getting them out of it. So I think, a lot of people have this idea that Denmark is really light on drugs, but they actually, until recently, the punishments are fairly severe if you're a dealer. Not if you, I mean, even now, until recently, you could also get punished fairly severely if you were a user. But we just had a tolerance for not actually throwing people in jail but rather try to treat them before. I mean, it was more. It was actually as everywhere else, the police use laws in their own gain. So if they wanted to target a specific group of people, they would use the laws to the full extent. But otherwise, there was a focus on treating. And I mean, about half a kilometer from where I'm living, we have the biggest fixer room in Northern Europe, where people can take the drugs in safe environment as possible.
Would it be fair to say that at least where it is, even if it's not where it was, would it be fair to say that Denmark's got more a war on addiction rather than a war on drugs?
Yeah, and a war on making money out of other people's addictions. So they're trying to hit down on it, but that's because there's a lot of. If you ever hear about shootings from Denmark, it's usually gang related and drug related, and it's about selling drugs.
Here in Canada, I promise you, we do not hear about shootings from Denmark. We hear about lots and lots and lots of shootings from another country that can remain nameless.
We have several shootings a year down here, and sometimes somebody even get killed. Well, wow. there were this once where it was a rocket launcher used in a fight between two biker gangs. That made international news. Rocket launchers is a little bit unusual after all.
I think Canada is slowly moving towards a similar thing. I hope so anyway, because I expect you all know a few years ago, Canada legalized, in a weird way, but legalized marijuana across the country. And locally, BC is, I think it's due to come into force in a couple of months, has recently legalized possession of small personal use quantity of some of the hardest drugs. Again, the idea being to try to provide harm reduction is what they're trying to achieve.
I don't interesting enough, neither of those things are legal in Denmark, so you can still get punished for it, but it just doesn't happen as a general rule. So that's why I say we still have the problem that police can use it against you if they want to.
So sort of a soft decriminalization.
Yes, and
yeah.
So, but it still leaves open
with all the problems that carries, obviously.
It still leaves open the possibility of what do police prefer to arrest or prosecute for? At which point, let's go back to Cryptdyke. I think she has a few words to say on topics like that.
Sure. So one of the things that I was just in a recent dust up online about was the banking collapse in 2008, where we actually know for a fact that the banks were vulnerable because of changes to Glass-Steagall, deregulation of, amongst other things, credit default swaps, which allowed these banks to be very highly leveraged, which means relatively small failures could lead to large cash flow disruptions, which could bankrupt the institution, either the investment institution or a bank. But the fundamental risk was created by these mortgage-backed securities, which were frequently promoted fraudulently. There was a great deal of fraud in the promotion of these mortgage-backed securities. And after it was all over, there's been this kind of myth that has been accepted by far too many people that that most of what the banks did was legal, and therefore we shouldn't be upset that the banks weren't really prosecuted, that the real problem is deregulation, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, most of what the banks do is legal, because saying, you know, hello, my name is Shonda, how can I help you, is still legal. The banks, of course, are doing shitloads of legal things every single day. I'm not commenting on the legal things that the banks do. The fact that we do a whole bunch of legal things does not mean that we should ignore the illegal things that we do. And the banks clearly engaged in large-scale fraud. And the only bank officers to be prosecuted after the banking collapse of 2008 were two officers of a community bank, a smaller bank that specifically catered to Chinese ethnically Chinese customers in, I believe, New York and New Jersey. And so this small community bank of people of color, by people of color, for people of color, this was where they found two people to prosecute, even though this widespread fraudulent activity was being conducted at the highest level by respected institutions, Morgan Stanley, all kinds of other, Wells Fargo. And Wells Fargo has had other scandals as well, where they opened accounts for people without permission. So somebody would come in and open a savings account, and the bank would also open a checking account and then charge people a monthly fee for the checking account to remain open, even when the person never intended to have a checking account. These types of fraud and abuse aren't actually criminalized. They aren't actually prosecuted in criminal courts. They are, in fact, crimes, but they're generally handled as regulatory endeavors. Whereas other things, you break a street lamp, that may be a relatively minor crime, and in fact may cost people a lot less money than what the banks are doing, either through the large frauds of mortgage-backed securities, or even the smaller frauds can nonetheless add up when a bank signs you up for a credit card or a checking account that you didn't ask for. It may actually cost much less, and yet it's handled in a completely different way. Individuals who are not doing their activity on behalf of a corporation are policed differently. And it's this difference in policing leads to a system where we can easily perceive that there's injustice happening, that the rich are getting away with things and the poor are not. And yet there are institutional justifications that appear coherent. Oh, it was a corporation that did this, not a person. There's nobody to put in jail. And these are the rationalizations that we use to avoid policing behaviors that are done on behalf of corporations. But of course, those behaviors done on behalf of corporations are done by individuals. And yet, even though we've repeatedly seen these frauds happening over and over inside of, most notoriously, Wells Fargo, we don't station cops inside Wells Fargo branches to watch out for fraud. Instead, we station cops in cars driving around neighborhoods looking for broken windows, a rock thrown at a fence, that sort of thing.
And in schools, especially in colored areas.
Correct. And so we have this very different policing system for different types of crimes. Even though both are criminal, we have chosen as a society, or our elected representatives have chosen for us, that we're going to police specific behaviors very differently. And I think it's incredibly useful to understand that prosecutors have the power to choose differently. They can choose to prosecute the people at Wells Fargo. They simply don't choose this. And I'd like to start making that a political issue for elected prosecutors. I'd like to make that a political issue for the people who appoint Queen's Counsel in Canada. These are really serious issues, and how we're policed, and even how much we're policed. There's a completely separate issue about in Portland. It appears that we have fewer police than in Vancouver, Canada. If you look up the police force for Vancouver and the police force for the United States city of Portland, Oregon, you'll find that Portland, Oregon has many fewer sworn police officers than Vancouver. But of course, in Vancouver, the officers also run the jails, which is a separate function for the county sheriff's deputies in the States. And when you add up the county sheriffs plus the city of Portland police, there are just as many, if not more, for Portland compared to Vancouver, and for Oregon compared to BC, even though Portland is slightly less populous than Vancouver, and Oregon is about 80% of the population of BC. And that doesn't even count all these other policing agencies which we've chosen to create in the United States. It becomes very difficult to determine exactly how much we're policed because we've created different specialty agencies. And so you may have people patrolling your street corner in Portland Police Department cars, but you may also have people patrolling your street corner as plainclothes DEA officers or FBI agents. And it's impossible to really figure out exactly how much any given neighborhood in the United States is policed. But what we do know is that they're policed very differently than, say, a business like Wells Fargo is policed, even though Wells Fargo branches, local branches, have consistently proved themselves to be epicenters, locations where if you just wanted to hang out and witness crime, go to a Wells Fargo branch and you're going to see a lot of crime.
Yeah. I note that a lot of the specific corruptions we've mentioned so far, the over-policing of areas where people of color live, the extra policing of schools in such areas, and indeed the gerrymandering itself, all winds up being a classic example of how systemic injustices can come into existence, because those all require redlining to have happened in order to create the neighborhoods that are segregated enough for all of those new injustices to be done. Does anyone agree with that?
Yeah, it's completely true, and I might point out it's a problem in all our countries. It's not just a US problem or even in North America. Denmark has the same problem. Yeah. There was recently a paper came out that actually looked at how people with an immigrant background, darker skin, how they're treated compared to everybody else, and they get arrested and accused of a crime much more often, and the charges drop much more often than everybody else. So they are charged more often, and they also the charge is dropped much more often. So it's just
the suggestion being they're charged frivolously a lot more.
Yeah, but the police claims that they're charging them more because of experience showed them. But no, you don't. You might believe so, but you have to drop the charges most of the time.
Well, if experience showed them it was the right thing to do, you wouldn't have the charges dropped, would you?
No, exactly.
Yeah, and in Canada, I would love to give you some stats, but we don't keep track of them. We have no idea if there's any racial profiling going on within our police services because we don't keep track of race within policing.
Oh, let's be clear on that. We don't, at an official governmental level, like in reports, know whether there's any racial injustice in policing in Canada. In all other ways, yes, we know very well there's lots and lots of racial injustice in policing in Canada, up to and including an epic moment a couple of years ago when the leader of one of our third largest party, well, across the country anyway, the New Democrats, who is a Sikh, accused. So there was a resolution that was non-binding. It wasn't even a law or anything, but the resolution was presented in Parliament to say, okay, look, we've seen there's problems with the RCMP. That's our federal police system. They've been doing some very racially bad things. We should talk about it. And the resolution passed unanimously across all, including all the conservatives, actually. All of the members of Parliament, with the exception of one guy in Quebec. He was Bloc, wasn't he? I can't remember at the moment.
I think Bloc, yes.
Yeah, we have a weird federal party that exists solely for one particularly whiny province, essentially.
The Republicans.
And
sorry.
The head of our NDP called him a racist for doing that, and got called out by the Speaker of the House, saying, "You're not allowed to call him a racist. You have to apologize." And the head of our NDP said no, and actually got thrown out of Parliament for the day for standing by that one guy being the only guy in the entire federal government unwilling to say that there's racist policies, well, not really policies, but racist practices in the federal police force. He stood up for that. No, we won't take it back. We got thrown out for it. It's like, wow. Which is like both, man, that's a racist thing to happen in the first place. Throw out the one man of color who's saying here, there's racist stuff happening. But also, even the federal government knows it. Like, only this one guy from a particularly problematic place refused to. It's like, it would be as though it would be in the States, the equivalent as though the entire Senate somehow agreed that there was a racist problem with something, except one guy from deep in the heart of Mississippi or something said no. Like, it's at that level of, they know.
The trying to think, that sounds unlikely, not because of the one guy from the state of Mississippi, but because of the rest of the Republicans agreeing.
Yeah, that is the weird thing. I don't know. That's recently the Canadian Conservative Party federally has done a few things that seemed, compared to the US version, really progressive, and then they got rid of their leader, so I'm not really sure what they're going to do next.
Yeah.
They didn't seem to like that.
Yeah, like for years
Anyway,
they were
banning.
For years they were banning conversion therapy. They were opposed to banning conversion therapy, but under their previous leader, we're finally okay with banning it. So
that one passed unanimously. Anyway, so we've reached the end of this. Any last thoughts, Christian?
Well, it seems like the judicial system is different in different countries, and we're not surprised by that. I think one aspect we might touch on at some other time is kind of the behavior towards the indigenous people in all our three countries, because I think we all know there's problems with that kind of way, which we haven't really approached in this podcast.
Yes. Well, we've kind of mashed it all together under the racist part of policing and justice system problems, but even that is not necessarily equal.
Here there's a little bit of flavor, because indigenous people in Denmark, I was talking about people from Greenland and that kind of stuff. There's a weird way they behaved outside the court system in many ways, and I know there's a similar problem in Canada and the US with Native Americans and stuff like that.
HJ.
Oh yeah, if you want to follow up on that, Canada Land, it's a podcast, has a great series on the RCMP itself and the bullshit they've gotten into. Like, just to give you one highlight, an injunction against a logging company was tossed out of court because of the behavior of the RCMP. The logging company was in the clear in terms of the law and all that, but the injunction was still tossed out because the RCMP's tactics were so extreme. According to the judge, it brought the legal system into disrepute, and so it could, the judge could not actually enforce the order. There's a lot more to it than that, so I would recommend sort of seeing that series. In general, yeah, this could be multiple episodes of this, so yeah, it's good. It's a very large, complicated topic. I might even write a blog post on the Calgary municipal elections, just because it's kind of interesting to sort of point out the election chicanery that happens within Canada itself. But yeah, our system, judicial electoral, is not perfect and is in dire need of some sort of update.
Yes, we spend rather too much of our Canadian time being smug that we're not the worst. I feel like a higher bar is called for.
Yeah.
Anyway, Cryptdyke, any last thoughts?
Sure. One of the things that we didn't get to touch on, which I would like to at some future point, is, well, actually, let me say two things. One is the defund/abolish the police movement. I think that we should cover that at some point. But the other is how minors are treated. We have a juvenile justice system in the United States that typically doesn't serve justice. And the rationale for having a separate juvenile system is frequently undermined by policing in schools, the trend towards school resource officers, which was covered recently by John Oliver. If you're not familiar with that segment, you should check that out. But also there are other things that have been slowly chipping away at protections that minors have in the judicial system in the United States. And again, because we're largely a state-by-state system in the United States, it's very different in different states. Oregon's a little bit better than, say, California or Alabama. California can be particularly bad depending on where you are, even though it's supposed to be a statewide system and there are supposed to be better protections. California's system is regionalized to an extent that other states aren't necessarily justified occasionally on the basis of large population. But even so, there should be some minimum standards, and there are many states that aren't meeting these standards. And we should be talking about how we're failing the young people in these judicial systems.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good topic for another talk. I would be interested. But for this talk is now finished. Thank you all for listening. Thank the three of you very much for your extremely interesting contributions. This was an especially interesting discussion today, I think. So for all of our single digits worth of listeners, from HJ, Christian, Kryptike, and me, thanks for joining us, and see you next time.